Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here today. I hope you've all had a great couple of weeks. Today we are going to be talking about a man named Lee Sexton. This case was actually a suggestion from one of my subscribers, Stephanie Renee, so thank you so much, Stephanie, for taking the time to suggest this case. It's honestly hard to put into words just how awful this man was. Eddie and his wife May had 12 children together, and Eddie controlled every single move his family made. This family has actually been referred to as a cult by the media and by experts that have looked into this case. And as we start talking about it, I'm sure that you're going to be able to see all the signs. He isolated them, he mentally beat them down and abused them. He had them thinking that he was the only person in the world that they could trust. The level of dysfunction in this family is really hard to put into words. Eddie had created this insanely messed up environment where he was the center of everyone's world, and he had them all under his control. And the level of control and brainwashing was so intense and so extreme that in the end, the children were willing to do whatever Eddie wanted them to do, and this ended in absolute tragedy. The book that I read as part of my research is called House of Secrets, and the author said that Lee Sexton is the most disturbed and heinous of all the psychopaths and narcissists he's written about in half a dozen true crime books. So needless to say, this is going to be a very intense case. This one is definitely not for you if you struggle to hear anything about the mistreatment of children. Unfortunately, the abuse of children is a very prominent theme in this case, so just a huge warning if you don't want to listen to something like that. I actually have a hard time with stuff like that myself, so this one was a really rough one to research. And I do want to mention really quick that there aren't a lot of photos out there about this case, but I did my best to include everything that I could find. Okay, we have a lot to talk about, so let's just go ahead and jump in. But before we do, I want to thank today's sponsor, Surfshark. Like most content creators in the true crime genre, my internet search history does not look good. I have to dig into some pretty dark areas of the internet for the sake of my research. So having Surfshark VPN is an absolute must for me since starting my channel. A VPN is a virtual private network, and it essentially acts as a mask, keeping my strange search history hidden and protected. It takes me quite a while to edit just one of my videos, and sometimes I go stir crazy in my house and I need to change the scenery. So I'll pack up my laptop and I'll go sit down at one of my local coffee shops and I'll continue working there. And having a VPN just gives me that added peace of mind that I'm going to be protected everywhere I go. Surfshark also makes it possible to access movies and TV shows that are otherwise restricted in your country by replacing your actual IP address to make it appear as though you are accessing the internet from a different part of the world. As some of you may have noticed, I am a huge Studio Ghibli fan. Spirited Away and Howl's Moving Castle are two of my favorites, but I don't have access to those on the US Netflix. So I just log into my Netflix account, then using my VPN, I switch my location to the UK, and just like magic, there's no face. Another thing that I absolutely love about Surfshark is that I can use my one account on all of my devices. That means that no matter which device I use, I know that I'm going to be protected. Surfshark VPN is already insanely affordable, but right now you can use my code SUMMER to get 83% off and 3 months free by going to surfshark.deals/summer or checking my description box for the link to get started. That's SUMMER with an O to get 83% off and 3 months free. Thanks again to Surfshark for sponsoring this video, and now let's jump back into the case. Lee Sexton was born on May 12, 1942 near the city of Logan, West Virginia, to his parents Chester and Lana Sexton, and he was the youngest of 10 children. His father was a coal miner and a Baptist preacher, and as far as I could tell, Eddie's mother stayed home to take care of the 10 children. The family did not have much money at all. They were essentially living in poverty. They grew their own food, and in the winter they had no heat and they had no coal, so the kids would take turns going down by the train tracks and they would look for pieces of coal that had fallen off of the trains, and that's how they would stay warm in the winter. When Eddie was very young, the family moved from West Virginia to Ironton, Ohio, but their situation got even worse when Eddie's father passed away at the age of 52 of a sudden heart attack, and Eddie was only 10 years old when he lost his father. Then his mother suffered a stroke that left her with permanent damage and lifelong struggles with her health. According to Eddie's older brother Otis, Eddie was absolutely, without a doubt, their mother's favorite child. She coddled Eddie and she always gave him more than the other children ever had. And this treatment continued throughout Eddie's childhood and into his adult life. Eddie would later claim that his brother Otis beat him constantly when they were growing up, but Otis and some of the other siblings flat out deny these claims. As Eddie got older, he started to act out, and at the age of 14, he was sent to a reform school after he robbed a store. Otis actually enlisted in the army, and eventually Eddie decided to do the same thing, but he didn't last long at all, maybe 6 months, and then he was discharged for bad conduct. In 1963, when Eddie was 20 years old, he married his 15-year-old pregnant girlfriend. And we don't know very much about this relationship, but we do know that it didn't last long because just the very next day after the wedding, Eddie was involved in an armed robbery of a gas station. He ended up being sentenced to 5 years in prison for his part in the armed robbery, and his wife went on to give birth to a son. Not long after the baby was born, she filed for divorce. Eddie served his time and he was released from prison, and in 1967 he met a woman named Estella Mae Carson, mostly known as Mae to her friends and family. Mae was also one of 10 children, and by all accounts, she had a really good life. Her father was a career military man, and the family had lived on several different military bases around the United States, including Fort Knox. Mae was described as being outgoing and beautiful. She was a cheerleader. She loved to dance and go on outings with her large family. There was no abuse or excessive fighting in the home either. Her parents were not overly strict. They all had friends and social lives, just a well-adjusted, loving family. When Mae was 20 years old, she got pregnant by her boyfriend Bill right before he was set to leave for Vietnam. Mae gave birth to a son she named Patrick in 1967, and she never heard from Bill again. She never found out if he died in battle or if he made it back to the States but just broke contact with her. But he was never a part of her life after that. And unfortunately, Mae met Eddie Lee Sexton the same year that her son was born. Now, when Eddie met Mae, he told her that he had joined the military right out of high school, and that's what he had been doing since he graduated. But this was just a lie that he had concocted to explain those 5 missing years when he was in prison for that robbery. So Mae didn't know that Eddie had a record when they met, and she also didn't know that Eddie had already been married once before. She had asked him when they first met if he had ever been married, but he told her no. And in the beginning, other than these 2 major lies, their relationship was actually good. Eddie was nice and he was polite and he was very respectful. In fact, it took him 4 dates to even kiss Mae. But this was all an act just to lure her in and get her to fall for him, and then once he had her under his control, the true Eddie would come out. Eddie's true colors eventually came out, and he started acting really controlling and manipulative and abusive. Mae was in too deep at this point already. She was very much in love with Eddie, and she had also already gotten pregnant with one of his children. So when Eddie asked her to marry him, she said yes. Mae's family got bad vibes from this guy from the very beginning when they first met, and they tried so many times to talk Mae out of being with him, but nothing they said worked, and Mae and Eddie were married in 1970. They settled down in Jackson, Ohio, and then they just started adding to their family, and eventually they would go on to have 12 children, 7 boys and 5 girls. And Eddie did that thing that most abusers do, and he completely isolated Mae from her family, and she wouldn't see them again for 10 years. In the 1970s, Eddie went into the family business and became a preacher, and he also became ordained so that he could perform marriage ceremonies. The Sexton children remember lots of young couples coming to their home so Eddie could marry them. The children would get all dressed up, and Mae would cook these big meals, and the couples would come over and Eddie would perform the ceremony. Everyone thought Eddie was so great. The community loved Eddie Sexton. He was always just real calm and soft-spoken and charming and just overly polite, so everyone thought he was great. No one suspected the real reason that Eddie had started his church either, which was essentially just to make money. His church was just one of many cons that he'll go on to commit. And the church was set up in this little storefront, and he named it the Calvary Church of God. The church consisted mostly of Mae and the kids and a small group of people from the community. This church only lasted for about 6 months, though, because Eddie started preaching about some pretty off-the-wall stuff. His religion mostly consisted of his own psychotic ramblings and twistings of scriptures. So by the end, the only people there to listen to him was his own family. Eddie took odd jobs just to make ends meet. He would work sometimes as a painter or a handyman. But most of the family's money actually came from the disability and Social Security checks that Eddie received. He claimed that he had severely injured his back some years before, and he also claimed to have multiple sclerosis. And I couldn't really determine if he actually did have MS or if it was all just made up for the disability. The information online was a little unclear, but the children did later say that when caseworkers or charity workers would come to their house, he would have a wheelchair and he would get into the wheelchair and he would pretend like he couldn't get around at all. But as soon as the people would leave, he would stand up and he was totally fine. So at the very least, he definitely exaggerated his symptoms if he actually did have MS. It was later determined that Eddie was pulling in more than $50,000 per year in disability at one point. Eddie also came up with a plan to commit insurance fraud by claiming his house had been broken into. He reported that $20,000 worth of valuables had been taken from his home, and he even made an itemized list. And this part just gets me because one of the line items was a certificate of recognition from the US Congress for Vietnam service, and where he was supposed to list how much this cost, he just put "can't replace," as if he had actually been to Vietnam and won an award for his service, when in reality, he didn't even make it 6 months and he was discharged for bad conduct. Another con he came up with was much more sinister, and it actually led to an investigation by the FBI. So Eddie came up with a plan to burn down his house and collect the insurance money. But not only that, he planned to do this while some of his least favorite children were still in the house. So on the day that Eddie decided to put this plan into action, he made plans for he and May to take his favorite children out for the day, and he had a babysitter come into the home to stay with the other kids. He started the fire under the stairs on some wiring to make it look like an electrical fire. He and May left with their children, and the babysitter was in the house with the other kids. But before anything significant could actually happen, the babysitter decided to take the kids out for ice cream. And this was not the only fire that Eddie was associated with either. There were other fires in the Sexton home. It seems like the authorities suspected that Eddie was behind the fires, but they couldn't really ever prove it. Now, like I said, most of the people in the community really liked Eddie. He was really good at portraying himself as this, very religious, family-oriented man. People in the community really liked him. But what was actually going on inside of that house was an absolute nightmare. So just a warning, from here on out, we're going to be talking about some very upsetting facts of this case. Somewhere along the way, Eddie Lee Sexton just lost any shred of humanity he had left. And he ran his family like a cult. And Eddie was the center of everything. He began preaching his own form of religion to his family, where he claimed to worship both God and Satan. And the topic of sex was always a big part of his preachings. And one day he told his family to walk outside of their house with him, and they walked into their rock garden, and they had this statue of Jesus. And it was one of those where Jesus is holding his arms out. And then Eddie grabbed a hatchet and he chopped the arms off of the Jesus statue. And this is where the more cult-like behavior really starts. Eddie started conducting seances after this, where he would light a bunch of candles and he'd make his family stand in a circle around a table that had satanic symbols on it. And Eddie would emerge from the darkness with a black cape on, and he'd be speaking in tongues and just saying very off-the-wall stuff. He would tell his family to hand their souls over to Satan. Just bizarre things that the kids were not used to hearing. Just a warning, there is a very brief mention of animal abuse, so if you don't want to hear that, just skip ahead like a minute. Eddie had his family come into the room and stand around the table with the satanic symbols, and they were just waiting for him to, emerge from the darkness. The children noticed that there's something laying on the table, and it's under a sheet right in the center of the pentagram. Then Eddie walked in wearing his cape, and he walks straight over to the table and he pulls the sheet off of the thing that had been laying there. When the children saw what was under there, they were in shock. It was the family's cat, Misty, and she was not alive. Eddie picked up the cat and cut her open and drained the blood into a chalice. Then he made May and all of the children sip the blood from the chalice. I think the fact that the kids actually obeyed Eddie and sipped blood of their own cat from that chalice just proves how much control he had over them and how afraid they were of him. After it was over, Eddie told his children to never speak of what they'd just done. He also became obsessed with the idea that he and one of his younger daughters, Lana, were what he called Futuretrons. He told people that he and Lana had these markings on their hands, and the markings meant that they were Futuretrons, and it made them a target for satanic cults. And if the Satanists found them, they would be sacrificed. He would tell this to lots of people, and he would even show these people his hands and Lana's hands. Then Eddie would tell them that he was in the middle of negotiating a multi-million-dollar deal with Wendy's and Burger King franchises to do a national promotion since they were Futuretrons. Promotion of what? I don't know, but this is what Eddie told people. And understandably, these people would walk away from this conversation thinking that Eddie Lee Sexton was losing it. Eddie would also intentionally and randomly terrify his children. On one occasion, two of the Sexton sons, Matthew and Charles, were just laying down in their room. They were trying to fall asleep because they had school the next day, when suddenly they start hearing something on their roof. So they both get up out of their bed and they walk over to their window to see where this noise is coming from. And when they look out the window, they see what they described as a beast. The boys totally freaked out and they started screaming for their mother, and May comes running into the room to see what's going on. The boys tell her all about the beast that was outside of their window, but by the time she made it into the room and looked out the window, the beast was gone. And then Eddie comes into the room and he's like, what's going on? What's all the yelling about? So the boys then tell Eddie everything they had just told May about the beast and all of the weird noises. And Eddie's like, oh yeah, that was Satan. He had come to take your soul, but if you're really good and you do whatever I say, then Satan won't get you. I can protect you. And of course, the beast that they saw outside was just Eddie. He was dressed up in some sort of disguise to freak his kids out. And he's just manipulating his children into looking at him as like their ultimate savior and protector so that he can completely control them. This was not an isolated incident. This happened lots of different times with several of the other children. Eddie also isolated his family from the outside world, and he would only let them go to school, and they weren't allowed to talk to anyone or to have a social life. They weren't even allowed to ride the bus. Eddie or May would drive the kids to and from school to make sure that they walked in and they just walked back out and went straight home. Most of the Sexton children were extremely quiet in school, and they would get a reputation for being kind of weird because they just wouldn't talk to anyone. And a lot of times if anyone did ever try to talk to the Sexton kids, they were just blank. They didn't really say anything. It was almost like they were looking right through you. Some of the people close to this case actually gave that blank look a name, and they called it the Sexton stare. But there were some of the Sexton kids that took a different approach, and they would cope by trying to fit in. But this was hard for them because they couldn't relate to the other kids. They had no concept of what the other kids were doing after school or what kind of things they did for fun or anything like that, because the Sextons weren't allowed to do anything fun. So some of them would just secretly study their classmates' mannerisms and their conversations, and they would essentially just try to mimic them in order to fit in. Eddie had just completely isolated everyone in that house. And I truly wish that this was the extent of the dysfunction that was the Sexton family, but it doesn't even scratch the surface. Because Eddie Lee was extremely abusive to his children in literally every way imaginable. Eddie had a saying in the household that once a kid turned 16, they would graduate from the belt to the fist, and he 100% stood by that. He was also physically abusive to May as well, but it definitely seems like the kids got the most of it. And if the beatings left bruises or markings on them, then they were just made to stay home from school until they had healed, which was like torture for these kids. They actually loved school. They looked forward to going to school because it was an escape from the terror that filled their home. If the children ever messed up in any way, or if they dared to question their father, they would be brutally beaten. And Eddie would come up with really cruel punishments for the children as well. He once forced two of his sons to stand naked in the living room in front of the entire family with their arms extended out, and then he would put encyclopedias on their arms and just make them stand there. Nudity seems to be a theme in these extremely abusive cases because it just adds another layer of humiliation to the victim, and it just makes them even more vulnerable. There was another incident involving Charles and one of the other brothers where they cut a bike tire in half and they used it as a slingshot, and they shot a battery out of their bedroom window. I don't know what kind of battery this was, but it must have been something heavy, because when the battery flew out the window, it hit their neighbor, and it hit him in the head, and it actually injured the neighbor. So the neighbor ends up calling the cops, and the cops show up. Eddie made it very clear that he didn't want any attention brought on the family because he didn't want people to know what was going on in the house. So when the boys saw the officer, they knew they were in big trouble. So the officer comes to the Sexton house and talks to Eddie, and the boys never knew how he did it, but he managed to kind of de-escalate the whole thing, maybe charm his way out of, the boys getting in any trouble, and the officer ended up leaving. But the boys knew that they were in for a severe punishment because they had now brought unwanted attention onto the Sexton house. And sure enough, when Eddie came back into the house, he went straight up to the boys' bedroom and he locked them in a closet. As they're standing in this closet, they notice some fog that's coming up from underneath the door, and they realize that their father had Raid bug spray, and he was spraying it up under the door and into the closet. The boys eventually passed out from the fumes, and they didn't wake up till the next day. And this was not the only time this form of punishment was used. He was always coming up with just like weird ways to punish his kids. And they lived in constant fear of Eddie, but they were also taught that he was the only person that could save them from the devil. So they just all felt trapped. Charles Sexton actually went on the show Evil Lives Here on Investigation Discovery, and he gives a firsthand account of a lot of the abuse that went on in the home. And he said when he was only 8 years old, he found one of the family guns, he grabbed it, he went and found his father, who was sleeping at the time, and he cocked the gun, put the gun right in his father's face, ready to pull the trigger. But Eddie ended up waking up before he could do that. Somehow Eddie talked him down and got the gun out of his hand. Charles says that every day of his life, he wishes that he would have pulled the trigger that day when he was 8 years old, because it would have saved the family years of torment and tragedy. Now, Eddie may have had most of the community fooled into thinking he was like this great guy and really good father, but there were people close to the family who saw the abuse firsthand, and they would call DHS to report Eddie and May for mistreating the kids. There were several calls made on the Sextons over the course of like 13 years, but one of the first calls was made anonymously by Eddie's own sister in 1979. One day, Eddie's sister Stella received a very upsetting phone call from Otis Sexton about some very concerning things going on in Eddie's home. Otis told her that his teenage daughters had been asked to babysit Eddie's kids, and when they got there, they were shocked at the conditions that the kids were living in. First of all, the house was in a terrible state and there was no electricity. When Otis's girls asked why there was no electricity in the house, Eddie told them that some of the kids had urinated on the light sockets, and so he had disconnected all the wires so they wouldn't get hurt. Not only that, some of the children had been locked in their bedrooms and tied to their beds. Otis's daughter Teresa found James Sexton, who was only a toddler at the time, laying all by himself in a playpen in a totally dark room with a sheet covering the window. When she found him, he was covered in his own waste, and she could tell that he had been laying there for a really long time. So Teresa picked him up and she carried him out of the room, and as soon as the light hit his eyes, she said he just went crazy and started screaming in pain. So who knows how long that baby had been laying in that room by himself for him to react like that. Another one of the Sexton kids, Michelle, who was only 3 years old at the time, was found tied to her bed by her wrists and her ankles with shoelaces, and she was also just laying there in her own waste. Teresa immediately began trying to untie the shoelaces, but they were knotted so tightly that she couldn't get it undone, so she had to call her father to help her. And when Otis arrived and saw what was going on and saw the state of the house, he was absolutely disgusted. So he called his sister Stella to tell her everything he had seen, because he just didn't know what to do. And that's when Stella made that anonymous report on Eddie and May to the DHS, or Department of Human Services. And this was just one of almost a dozen reports filed on the Sextons over the course of 13 years. But each and every time that something would happen and Eddie and May would be investigated, Eddie would just manage to weasel his way out of it. He always had a lie in his pocket and a story to explain everything away. He would also start out these meetings during these investigations by handing the caseworkers his minister card to prove that he was this really religious man who would never hurt his children. And sadly, this worked. Time after time, the Sextons were investigated. Eddie would deny everything. The children would be too afraid to actually talk and say what was actually going on, and the case would be closed. One of the caseworkers even wrote in her notes that Eddie was a good father who was just doing the best he could with such a large family. It's just heartbreaking to think about the chaotic environment that these kids were growing up in. And there were opportunities for them to be helped by the DHS, but in the end, nothing would ever be done. So far we have talked about mental abuse, we've talked about physical abuse, but unfortunately, we do need to talk about the sexual abuse that was going on in the house, because it does play a huge role in what happens in today's case. Eddie Lee forced himself on most, if not all, of his children, the boys and the girls. The abuse would typically start around the age of 12, but it could have been slightly earlier or later for some of the children. And May would also take part in this abuse as well. After years of physical and mental abuse at the hands of Eddie, May no longer resembled who she used to be. That happy, outgoing, beautiful girl was completely gone, and what remained was this beaten down woman who eventually fell into the same sadistic ways as her husband. Whether it was done out of fear or otherwise, she did still take part in it. There were times where some of the children would be given medication to put them in a deep sleep, and some of the abuse would happen then. According to the children, this was something that May would participate in. And the reason we know this is because some of the children actually woke up in the middle of the abuse. May would watch as Eddie abused their children, and sometimes she would even hold them down during the assaults. She definitely started out as a victim, but somewhere down the road, she took on some of Eddie's sick fantasies with her own children, and that makes her just as guilty. Those kids had no one they could turn to. The DHS had failed them multiple times. Their father was an absolute monster, and he literally tortured them constantly, and they didn't even have a mother around for any support or safety. They were trapped in that house with two predators who watched their every move. And just to be sure that no one talked about the abuse that was going on in the home, Eddie would force his kids to spy on each other. So a lot of times the kids couldn't even count on each other either. In the mornings before school, he would line all the kids up and he would hand them each a quarter, and he would tell them that if they saw any of the others talking to a teacher, counselors, or anybody like that, that they were to get to a payphone immediately and call him. He also told them that if they tried to report any of the abuse to any sort of authority or teacher, counselor, anything like that, that they wouldn't be believed, and then they'd just call Eddie anyways, and then they would be in really big trouble. So they were all terrified to ever say anything. And there were times where the kids did use those quarters to call and rat their siblings out, especially if the boys saw the girls talking to anyone. Eddie was very worried about the girls in particular going and talking to anyone at the school. Charles Sexton actually details in that interview a time where he called his dad to report one of his sisters for talking to a teacher. She was just innocently talking about some assignment that they had. As soon as Charles saw her talking to the teacher, he used his quarter to call his dad and tell him what he'd seen. And when she got home, Eddie dragged her up to her room and severely beat her. Charles now really regrets calling his dad. He says that he did it out of fear because he thought that if his dad found out that he had seen her talking to a teacher and he didn't report it, that he would be the one to be beaten. The oldest daughter was named Estella May after her mother, but everyone called her Pixie. Pixie was definitely Eddie's favorite, and she would always tell on the other children for everything. She was kind of like Eddie's eyes and ears when he wasn't around. So the other children knew not to confide in Pixie about anything. And by the time Pixie was 17 years old, she and her father were sleeping together on a regular basis. According to the other Sexton children, Pixie was in love with their father. She obviously was under some sort of control. Whatever she thought was love was probably just the same type of connection that cult members have for their leaders. It reminds me of Stockholm Syndrome, where the victims form some type of emotional attachment to their abuser. One night, May and the kids were having a dance in their living room. This is something that the family did often because May loved to dance. So they'd play music from like the 60s and 70s, and they would all go into the living room and dance and listen to music and stuff. It was like one of the only fun things that the family did, and the children really looked forward to it. So they're all in the living room and they're dancing and they're having a good time. Suddenly, Pixie and Eddie emerge from another room, and Pixie is wearing a wedding veil. Eddie announced to the family that he and Pixie were going to get married that night, and he proceeded to perform the wedding ceremony right there in the living room. And everyone is just standing there in total shock and just confusion. And this is so sick, but Eddie would go on to perform the same type of ceremony with at least 2 more of his daughters. And then after the ceremony, the girls would be abused. During Pixie's junior year of high school, she ended up pregnant. And this was pretty shocking to the kids at Pixie's school because they knew Pixie wasn't allowed to date anyone. I mean, she wasn't even really allowed to speak to anyone. They knew how strict her parents were. They knew that she wasn't allowed to really ever leave the house. So how did she get pregnant? Pixie and Eddie came up with a story that the baby's father was in the military, but the other Sexton kids knew that Eddie was the father. Some of them had actually walked in on Eddie and Pixie while they were sleeping together on more than one occasion. And they knew better than anyone that Pixie never had the opportunity to meet a guy and have sex with him. She was never outside long enough for that to ever happen. So they figured out that Eddie was the baby's father pretty quickly. Pixie ended up giving birth to a baby girl that she named Dawn, and everyone was just supposed to pretend like this was some military guy's baby. Then when Pixie was in her senior year of high school, she got pregnant again. Again, this pregnancy was explained away pretty much the same way. Pixie said that the guy had come in town briefly from the military and they had hooked up, and she got pregnant again. Another baby girl was born, and this one she named Shasta. Then 18-year-old Sherry Sexton also got pregnant, and Eddie did not want her to have this baby. He knew that people were going to start asking more questions. People were already curious as to how Pixie had 2 children when no one ever saw any guys going in to the Sexton home, and they knew that Eddie had a very strict no dating policy on his girls. And now another one of his daughters is pregnant. He knew people were going to start getting suspicious about more babies popping up in the household. So in an attempt to keep the rumors down, Eddie ordered his son James Sexton to kick Sherry in the stomach to cause her to miscarry. And that's exactly what happened, and Sherry ended up losing the baby the very next day. Sherry was so upset about the loss of this baby, but before long she was pregnant again, and I don't know why, but Eddie let her keep this baby, and she ended up having a son that she named Christopher. So now there are 3 of Eddie's babies that he's now had with his own daughters, just living in the family home with the other Sexton kids and him and May. Around this time, Eddie became even more paranoid about the authorities catching up with him, and he started stockpiling guns, and he told the kids that one day there would be a war with authorities. And he told them that they needed to train really hard and get really good with a gun, that way when the authorities came they would know what to do. He trained all of them to shoot, to take the guns apart, and to put them back together. And by the end of his training, they were really good with a gun. Now, even though it was against the rules, Pixie did become acquainted with a boy from school named Joel Good. Both of Joel's parents had passed away when he was just 13 years old. His father died of a heart attack, and then shortly after, his mother died from complications with diabetes. And after they both passed away, he had originally been sent to live with his grandparents, but he ended up moving to Jackson, Ohio to live with his Aunt Teresa when he was a junior in high school. Joel Good was described as nice and good looking. He was kind of quiet. He had some learning difficulties. He had a little trouble picking up on things. It took him a little longer to catch on. He had a small group of close friends that he hung out with at school, and it was one of these friends, a girl named Terry, who actually introduced Joel and Pixie during their junior year of high school. But it wouldn't be until their senior year that they actually started dating. Joel started coming over to the Sexton house, and he'd hang out with Pixie's siblings, and everyone actually really liked him. Even Eddie seemed to like Joel. He was always nice and welcoming towards him. And this is weird, right? With everything we know about how controlling Eddie was and how attached him and Pixie were to each other, but now suddenly she's allowed to date. And not only that, but Eddie seemed to like Joel, and he seemed to encourage the relationship. There was actually a really simple explanation for this. Joel was being used as a cover-up for Eddie's incestuous relationship with Pixie. Eddie was starting to panic because Pixie had had 2 of his children already, and now she was pregnant with a 3rd. He knew Pixie needed to have a public relationship with someone so people wouldn't start asking more questions. So Eddie encouraged Pixie to find a guy to be with, and that way she could tell him that he was the father of the 3rd child. And that's exactly what Pixie did. She got with Joel, and she convinced him that she was pregnant with his baby. And Joel was actually so happy about this. He really wanted a family. It was a goal of his to have a wife and children one day. Joel was very close with his 2 aunts, Velva and Teresa, and they were concerned about this relationship with Pixie from the start. They were just worried about Joel being with someone who already had 2 children. They just didn't think he was ready for that. Not only that, but Joel's aunts just got a weird vibe from Pixie. She was always really quiet and just kind of blank, and they just couldn't get close to her. They had asked her about the father of her 2 daughters, Dawn and Shasta, and she had pretty much told them the same story, that it was someone that was in the military and he was no longer in the picture. Teresa also got weird vibes from Eddie Sexton. She actually went over to the house to talk to Eddie one day after Joel and Pixie started to get really serious. The whole thing just kind of creeped her out. While she was visiting at the Sexton house, she said it was very obvious that Eddie was the absolute ruler in that household and that everyone was afraid of him. But when he spoke to her, he was real calm and just tried to be charming. During that visit, the children wouldn't speak to Teresa. They just kind of stared off into space. But one thing that really just weirded her out was whenever Eddie started talking about him and Lana being Futuretrons, that whole thing. He told her all about the multi-million-dollar deal with Wendy's and Burger King, and then he told her about the satanic cults that were looking for them and they would be sacrificed if they were ever found. Just off-the-wall stuff. I keep imagining how I personally would have handled that situation, because I'm one of those people that, like, all of my emotions show on my face, and I don't know how Teresa made it through that meeting. And the more Teresa and Velva learned about the Sextons and about Eddie, the worse they felt about this relationship. After she met Eddie, Teresa started looking a little closer at Pixie's 2 daughters, Dawn and Shasta, and she noticed that the girls looked a lot like Eddie. Of course, this isn't unheard of because he is supposed to be the grandfather, but this resemblance was really strong, especially in the eyes, and it was enough to make Teresa wonder about Pixie's relationship with her father, especially after she saw the dynamic in the family, and she could tell there was just a weirdness there, and she could tell that Eddie was kind of like the ruler, the supreme ruler of that house. But there was no talking to Joel. He was head over heels in love with Pixie, and he really wanted to be with her, and he had gotten really attached to her 2 daughters. daughters. And before anyone knew it, Joel had moved into the Sexton home and he and Pixie were engaged. The wedding had been set for February 14th, 1992, Valentine's Day, but on February 12th, Eddie suggested that Pixie and Joel get married that day. And he also told Joel that it would be best if his family didn't know about this move update. And Joel, being so in love with Pixie and wanting to please his future father-in-law, he agreed. So they were married on February 12th, 1992, and Eddie Sexton even officiated the ceremony himself. Right after the wedding, Joel and Pixie went down to the local health department and filed a certificate of paternity. Joel was now claiming to be the father of Dawn, Pixie's first child. And the couple planned to go to another jurisdiction and do the same thing for Shasta. The rushed wedding and the certificates of paternity was all done in rapid succession. It was like this very urgent thing. And the reason it was so urgent is because just a few hours before Eddie officiated Pixie and Joel's wedding, the DHS paid another visit to the Sexton house, except this time action was being taken. Unknown to the other Sextons, in late 1991, Michelle Sexton started talking. She went to the school counselor and she started talking about some of the abuse that was going on in the house. She finally got the push she needed when she saw her father kissing her two younger sisters, Lana and Kimberly, in an inappropriate way. And she saw this and she immediately just realized that if she didn't speak up, that before long, Lana and Kimberly were going to be suffering the same abuse that she and Pixie and Sherry were suffering. But she wasn't ready to tell everything just yet. She didn't fully trust the system. At this point, the DHS had investigated the Sextons several times and nothing had ever been done, so she didn't really trust them yet. So she just kind of told them a little bit at first. But in February of 1992, Michelle finally told them enough to have her removed from the home. And just a few hours before the wedding, on February 12th, the DHS had brought Michelle over to the Sexton house to get her clothes together so she could be placed in foster care. This sent Eddie into a panic. So now he's got 3 kids from his incestuous relationships with his daughters. So at the very least, he figured that if he could convince Pixie and Joel to speed up the wedding and then get Joel to claim paternity of Dawn and Shasta, that would kind of take some of the heat off of him. And he could claim that Joel was the true father of all of Pixie's children. But the huge flaw in this is that if anyone actually dug deep into any of this story, it would immediately fall apart because Joel met Pixie 5 months after she had already had her first child. So there was no way he could be the father. But this is the plan that Eddie set into motion. Now, once Michelle was placed into foster care, it did take her a while to eventually open up about more abuse that was going on in the house, and she started talking about the other children, things that were happening to them, including a lot of the sexual abuse. And this was enough to get all of the minor kids out of the Sexton household. So on April 16th, 1992, the DHS went to the schools to pick the kids up before their parents could find out what was going on. But there were 2 kids who were in the Sexton home at the time, so they had to go to the house to pick them up. So the DHS goes to the Sexton house and they take the last 2 kids and load them up in the car. And as they were loading up the final 2 kids, Eddie Sexton tried to be charming and calm and use his southern drawl to say that he would never hurt his children, and this was all just a misunderstanding. Meanwhile, Mae Sexton is losing her mind, just screaming at authorities, saying, quote, "He doesn't molest anybody. He doesn't hurt none of those kids." The court ordered the minor children to be placed in temporary foster care while the DHS continued the investigation. The other children started to slowly open up as well. So now all these claims of abuse weren't just coming from Michelle Sexton. There were several kids talking about what was going on in the house. So Eddie Sexton was then ordered off the property, and he was told not to return to the family home or have any contact with Mae or the children while the investigation was ongoing. After a while, some of the children were returned home to Mae, but she had to promise that she wouldn't let Eddie anywhere near the children. At this point, the children hadn't revealed all the sexual abuse that Mae had taken part in, and this was the only reason why they were allowed to go back into her custody. There was still that no contact order, so Eddie wasn't legally supposed to return to the home or have any contact with his children. Eddie didn't follow this order, and he started showing up to the house on a regular basis. One day, Eddie arrived at the home and decided, screw this. I'm not leaving. I'm staying right here. He barricaded himself and his family into the home. He called the Jackson Police Department to tell them that he was in the home and he wasn't leaving. And if they wanted him, they were going to have to come pull him out of that house. But he was going to leave a trail of bodies if that happened. And before anyone knew it, a ton of officers were now right in front of the Sexton house. And this was a huge deal. They ended up having to evacuate the entire street. He gave all of his children guns, and he told them that if any of the officers made any wrong moves and came too close to the house, that they were to shoot. And they would have done it too. Charles, in that interview, said that at that point in his life, he was so brainwashed and so under his father's control that he would have shot to kill someone that day. But luckily that didn't happen. There was a 2-day-long standoff, and on the second day, one of the deputies called the house and Eddie picked up the phone, and somehow this deputy ended up talking him down and convincing him to come out and surrender. And Eddie was arrested and put in jail. And the kids felt like they could finally breathe a little sigh of relief. He was behind bars now, so they felt safe. But before long, for reasons I do not understand, Eddie was allowed to post bond. The no contact order was still in place, so he wasn't supposed to be at the house or contact anyone in the house. Of course, he didn't listen, and as soon as he was let out of jail, he went straight back over to the family's home, except this time he had a plan to run. He told May and the children to pack up what they could, and they were going to get in their travel trailer and head out of town. I honestly do not understand how he was allowed to post bond, given the circumstances of his crimes. He's already under investigation for some truly heinous acts against his children. He's breaking the no contact order left and right, and he's just coming off of a 2-day armed standoff with police. It's just really unfortunate that Eddie was allowed to post bond, because if he would have been kept locked up until the investigation was done, 2 innocent lives would have been spared. So Eddie and his kids and May pack up and they head to Florida, and they settle in a little secluded campground in Hillsborough River State Park. And all the while, Eddie is just constantly telling his children that they are at war with the authorities. At this point, Pixie had had her 3rd child, a little boy named Skipper Lee Good, and he was 9 months old. Pixie, Joel, Don, Shasta, and Skipper all head to Florida to join the family. Pixie ended up telling Joel at some point about the true paternity of Don and Shasta. So Joel now knew that Eddie was their father, and he was very upset when he found out. And he actually did confront Eddie about this when he found out, but Joel ended up receiving a pretty brutal beating for even mentioning it. Joel loved Pixie and he loved the kids so much, so he just chose to stay by Pixie's side and to stay in this relationship. But now there's like this intense tension between Joel and Eddie, and now they're all living together in this little camper. Now we're leading up to some very tragic events of today's case. I mean, this whole case has been tragic, but it's about to get worse. Baby Skipper got sick with a cold while they were all at the camp, and he had been miserable for weeks. But Eddie wouldn't let Pixie and Joel take Skipper to the doctor because he didn't want to bring any attention on the family because Eddie was on the run. At this point, the authorities knew that Eddie had skipped town. He and May didn't show up for a court hearing, so there was warrants out for both of their arrests, and they knew that. So Eddie didn't want any attention being brought to the family, so he wouldn't let Pixie and Joel take Skipper to the doctor. And so Skipper is just getting progressively fussier and fussier, and he wouldn't stop crying. And Eddie's getting really frustrated with Skipper because he's worried someone's going to hear the baby crying and it's going to bring attention to them. So he tells Pixie that if she doesn't shut the baby up, that he will. And this is when Pixie put her hand over Skipper's nose and mouth until he stopped breathing. The details of what happened next aren't very clear because several different versions have been told by the people who were there, but we do know that in the beginning, Pixie and Eddie claimed that Skipper had died in his sleep from SIDS. Now, Joel didn't see any of this happen, and when he finds out that Skipper has passed away, he is absolutely beside himself with grief. He's totally distraught, and he wants Skipper's body to be taken to the police station so that they could get him back to Ohio for a proper burial. But Eddie flat out refused to let this happen because he knew it would bring attention to the family. So Eddie ordered 2 of his sons, Charles and Willie, to go into the woods to bury Skipper, and the family had a little funeral for him there. So Skipper's death just caused even more tension at the camp. Joel just kept bringing up going back to Ohio, taking Skipper's body from the woods, bringing him to the authorities, and getting back to Ohio. That's pretty much all he would talk about. And he was still so heartbroken and upset by the death of his son. Sometime around Thanksgiving, Eddie decided it was time to leave Hillsborough River State Park. They had been there for quite a while, and then also Skipper was buried near their location, so he just felt like they needed to move. So he orders the family to pack up, and they ended up going to Little Manatee River State Park, and they set up camp there. This change of location didn't help to ease the pain that Joel was feeling at all, and all he could talk about was Skipper's death. And he continued to demand that they go back, get Skipper, and head back to Ohio to give him a proper burial. And eventually he started to get pretty loud about it. This really freaked Eddie out because now Joel knew a lot of the family secrets. So Eddie comes up with a solution, and he tells Charles and Willie to get in the car with him, and they all drive back to Ohio. Eventually, they arrive at the home of one of the oldest Sexton children, Eddie Jr. Eddie Jr. had moved out of the family home years before, and he had already started his own family. And it just so happened that he had a baby boy of his own. So when they arrive in front of Eddie Jr.'s home, Eddie Sr. hands Charles a gun, and he orders him to walk up to the door, knock on it, and as soon as Eddie Jr. comes to the door, he's supposed to shoot him and then take his baby. Eddie's plan was to try to replace Skipper so that Joel wouldn't keep pressing them to go to the authorities. And he was willing to murder his own son in order to cover up his crimes. And again, Charles is so far under Eddie's control at this point, he took the gun and he walked up to the door. He knocked on it, prepared to go through with these orders. But thankfully, no one answered the door that day, so they just went back to the camp in Florida empty-handed. But Eddie knew that Joel wasn't going to stop pressing the issue, so he decided that the only way to ensure that no one talked to the authorities was to kill Joel. So Eddie goes to Willie and he tells him that he needs to ask Joel to go for a walk in the woods, and while they're out there, he needs to put him to sleep. I should mention that Willie is said to have a very low IQ. One source said that he was mentally on the same level as an 8-year-old. So he was even easier to manipulate than everyone else. So Willie followed his father's orders and he took Joel into the woods for a walk. While they were out there, Willie attacked him from behind with some rope and he started strangling him. According to Charles, as Willie is behind Joel, strangling him with the rope, Eddie has a gun to Willie's head and he's just yelling at him to finish the job. Charles said that Willie was crying through the entire attack because he didn't want to kill Joel. He was just acting on his father's orders. Sadly, Joel did not survive the attack and he died right there in the woods. Then the boys buried Joel just like they had done to Skipper. Now, during this whole time, the authorities are still searching for the family. The FBI was even involved in the search. Then they finally got the break they needed when one of Eddie's brothers called the authorities to report that Eddie had actually been at his house recently, and he had used his phone to make 2 long-distance calls. So the authorities immediately check out these numbers, and one of them leads them to Little Manatee River State Park. Finally, they had a location, and after some very intense surveillance of the area, they confirmed that the family was there. And on January 14th, 1994, the FBI finally got Eddie and May while they were in the parking lot of a Winn-Dixie grocery store. They had been on the run for almost 14 months. And remember, at this point, authorities don't know anything about the 2 murders that have taken place. The authorities are actually there because of the charges back in Ohio, but everything was very quickly revealed when authorities questioned the children, and Charles told them all about what happened to Joel and Skipper, and he even helped to lead authorities to the bodies. And Joel and Skipper were eventually brought back to Ohio so Joel's family could give them a proper burial. Joel and Skipper Good were buried in the same casket. A paternity test was eventually done on Pixie's first 2 kids, Dawn and Shasta, and it was confirmed that Eddie was their father, but Joel's family opted out of a paternity test on Skipper. They knew how much Joel loved Skipper, and they probably just didn't want to know if Eddie was the actual biological father. All the Sextons say that Skipper was without a doubt Eddie's child, but Joel was the only real father that Skipper ever had. He loved him in a way that Eddie wasn't even capable of. So really, Joel is the true father, despite what a paternity test would prove. He's the only one who deserved that title. He was the only one fighting for Skipper in the end. And if Eddie had been given the chance, he would have abused Skipper just like all the other kids. Since Charles had cooperated with the police and he had even helped them to locate the bodies, he was granted immunities. So he wasn't charged with anything, but Eddie, May, Pixie, and Willie were. Some of the children even testified against their parents in court during the trials. They finally felt safe enough to break their silence after all those years of torture. And in November of 1994, Eddie was sentenced to death for his part in the murders, and he was sent to Florida's Union Correctional Institution to serve his time. Before the trial, a psychiatrist evaluated Eddie, and they concluded that he was a sadistic sexual psychopath. After some appeals, he was granted a new trial because of some of the stuff that came out in his first trial. They felt like it kind of clouded the judgment of the jury. Again, in this second second trial, he was sentenced to death. Eddie died of natural causes before he could be executed on December 29th of 2010. Now, May wasn't charged for any part in the murders, but she was sent back to Ohio to face 8 different charges related to physical and sexual abuse of her children, including complicity to rape, which carried a life term. And in the end, she was sentenced to life in prison, and she was sent to the Ohio Reformatory for Women. May died in prison of natural causes in 2017 at the age of 70. Pixie pled guilty to manslaughter charges in the death of Skipper, and she was sentenced to at least 6 years, but up to 12 years. I'm a little unclear on that. I saw conflicting reports on how long her sentence was. Willie was sentenced to 25 years in his part for killing Joel Good, and he was released in 2007. And while Willie was incarcerated, he came to realize that he was just completely under his father's control. None of his horrible crimes would have ever happened if it hadn't been for the control that Eddie had over him. And that was the tragic case of the sadistic psychopath Eddie Lee Sexton. This was just an absolutely tragic case, and I hope all of the victims are healing and are now living the best lives they possibly can. There's so much more to this story. This video literally could have been like 3 hours long. If you're interested in this case, I highly recommend that you read the book that I did, The House of Secrets. I'll link it in my description box along with all of the other sources for this case. I'll also leave some information about that episode of Evil Lives Here with that interview with Charles if you're interested. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing to my channel. I upload content just like this every other Sunday. Although I am getting closer to being able to upload more frequently. It's coming, I promise. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.